Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to make an LED glass and metal decorative garden ball. Now this is a very fancy ball. Look at how elegant and kind of Victorian it looks. So, as usual with these garden balls, I use foil, copper foil, and a bunch of wire, some glass, and a silicone ball. Now, this hoop that I use at the top of this item is a macrame type hoop that you can buy at many different places. I got this one on Amazon. And because solder doesn't like to stick to it, whenever you use metal that solder doesn't really want to stick to, I would suggest wrapping it in copper foil. Now this is the kind of foil that you would use to wrap your stained glass items. Whenever you do this, you would also need to press the foil down really strongly so that it's like one with your metal. So this will make a nice surface to work off of. Now you can use expensive black backed copper foil, or you can use just the least expensive that you can get. So it's really whatever you have on hand. Now I am attaching metal flat decorations. Now you can buy these at many different places and they come in all different shapes and sizes. The metal is an alloy, but most of the ones that I bought, actually all the ones that I bought from various different places, do accept solder, so that's not an issue. Now I used a silicone ball that you would buy for probably making molds with resin, and I fill it with some kind of stuffing to make it somewhat sturdy, and I put plastic on the end so the stuffing doesn't get all gooey. And I am centering my hoop around the top of this. Now I used enough of those metal designs to kind of fill the circumference of the ball that I am using, that white silicone ball. Now I'm using a wire. I think this is 18 gauge wire, maybe 22 gauge. I am using that to kind of be staples to hold it in place. Now, as you can see, you can just stab right into the silicone. It's quite strong, and you can take these wire staples, I call them, off later on, as you're not going to want to solder them in place. And the holes that you've created will not like ruin your sphere. So you can use this round silicone mold again and again. So I'm just using those wires to just hold it in place while I'm working. Now I'm trying to urge these metal filigree things to be symmetrical all the way around. And it looked to me like, yes, they're going to fill up very nicely the circumference of the sphere. But since I wasn't really sure if they should touch each other or have a gap between them each, the next thing I did was I took a thin wire and just kind of wired them loosely together, just to have a wire there. And so I attached those together, and then I used another piece of wire and did this to the next one. So I went all the way around trying to use the same, the widest part of this design and the same spot on each one, so that I would be able to figure out how close these should be together. You know, because I'm like, well, should they touch? Should they overlap? Should there be a gap between them? You know, it's really kind of hard to tell because, you know, I didn't know exactly where they fit in the circumference. And, you you know, I could have measured them and then tried to mathematically decide how close they could be, but this way worked very nicely. So I made like a little loopy guy, and I just kind of held them together temporarily. So as you can see, I'm going all the way around. Most of this video I'm showing you at like 4 times normal life. So it has been sped up a little bit, but I mean, feel free to adjust your watching if you can, if it gets too boring. So what I did was I made sure that I had a loop between each one, and now I took tweezers and pliers, and I just twisted them. I went around and around and around, twisting them so they looked like they were the same distance apart all the way around, and then I just kept going back and forth around in the circle till it seemed like they were snug against the silicone ball. So as you can see, I'm trying to make them the same as I went. And I probably use like 26 gauge wire, just kind of thin wire that I happen to have, and I will try to remove it later before I solder. But if some of it's left on when I'm soldering, that's okay, because it's copper wire, it will solder in place. And then I'm pushing them down and trying to lay it down. But then look, they ended up being symmetrically spaced. Now I'm using a little bit thicker wire. I believe this is 18 gauge wire, and I cut a bunch of them all the same length. What these are going to do is they are going to go between the filigrees that I just put on. So I'm deciding that I'm going to have this wire in between each one, and that will help continue my design. Now, when I'm making these decorative balls, I don't have a complete design in my mind, like completely laid out. I kind of have an idea of what I want, but I do let it change as I go. So, I'm not adverse to changing my mind. I'm watching and seeing what seems to be working. So right now I'm putting a wire between each one of them, and they are going to go to the other end of the sphere, as you can see. After I got them all done, I twisted them together at the end, and now I am trying to center them within that, between each one of those filigree guys. So at times I thought it would be best to hold them in place. At other times I just let them sit for now. Now I have some 18 gauge wire. I want some loops. Now I found this great way to make loops. If you have an old electrical porcelain piece that you would use for light, for some light fixture, you can use that with 18 or 16 or 14 gauge, any of those gauges. I guess thinner would work also, but it will allow you to use pretty thick wire, which is just awesome. And you just wrap them around and then untwist them after you have it all smooth, and you got perfect circles. As you can see, really nice circles. The reason why I'm saying use thicker wires, because the thicker the wire, the stronger the coil is going to be, and it'll keep its shape. I mean, yeah, you could use really thin wires if you wanted to in something like this, but by the time you uncoil it, they're probably going to deform somewhat. Now I'm using some wire cutters, and I am now cutting them even with each other. So I'm using the where one of them ends, and then just resting the wire cutters right against that end and clipping. And now I have a bunch of these perfectly round circles that I'm going to be using in my project. I'm kind of straightening them up a little bit because, you know, they were a little bit off. Because of the fact that they were coils. So I'm flattening them out. Now I know I need to have 8, but you know, if I have a couple more, that's fine. And if I have to make more, you know, I can do that. And I laid them in place between each of the other wires that I put in. And now I am actually taking a smaller, like 22 gauge copper wire, and using that to kind of hold the areas together. So I'm adding macrame hoops that have been wrapped that fit. Now, so I have a bunch of different round hoops, and of course, if you don't have the hoops, you can take a piece of copper wire and make your own circle. You don't have to buy, you know, pre-made hoops if you don't want to. But I'm kind of like threading them around to hold them in place. And you can see at the bottom are those nice round pieces of 18 gauge wire that I showed you how I made them so perfect earlier. So I'm using wires right now just to hold them all together. Because I'm going to solder this, but I need to have it pretty accurate before I start soldering, because it's easier to make sure everything fits before you solder things together. So yeah, I'm going to have to adjust a little bit, but it's pretty much ready to be soldered now. So I ended up like tack soldering different areas together. So I decided this end of the filigree guy is going to have to be soldered securely to the hoop all the way around. So that would be a good idea. And also, in order to make it all similar in color when I'm done, I'm going to patina it with a copper patina when I'm done. But I need to coat the filigree and everything else with solder. So the actual copper will end up, you know, looking copper colored once the copper patina is copper colored, but it's not exactly the same color as the copper wire. But I don't really mind if there's a little discrepancy. But the gold filigree things that I have will definitely look different. Now, when you buy your metal pieces that you want to add to your creations, they come in different colors. So if you can get one that looks about the color of what you want your finished product to be, you could do that. So I had a choice of silver or this gold color, and at the time I ordered it, I decided to choose the gold color. They pretty much all take the solder the same, except for the really dark colored alloy metal things. They tend to not take solder as well. So if you can stick with the silver colored or the gold colored metal filigree guys, you'll probably have better luck covering them with solder later on. Now, as you see, I have a whole bunch of scraps on my work surface, which really needs to get cleaned up. So I use brand new solder, like that piece that I'm holding. That's a brand new piece of solder. Or I suck up some old drops on the ground. Now, never throw away your scraps of solder. You can always reuse them. So I do have a video where I took silicone and made a shape of a wire, a thick wire, and melted scraps of solder into it so that I had like a long piece of solder made from used solder globs, so it was easier to reuse them. So you can do that. That's fine, or you could just suck them up from your work surface, or use new pieces. It's really up to you. I use 60-40 solder. It works very nice. Now you may notice that my soldering tip is not the best shape. I ordered a new one. I'm still waiting for it to come in. It's just getting a little bit old. On the top right hand corner there is a piece of I can't even remember what kind of material is, but it's supposed to help clean your solder tip, and I did use that some, but my solder tip is just too old. It's just needs to be replaced. There's only so long they work, and I think because a lot of my work I am coating things with solder, they do wear out. Now, as you can see, each of these circles that I made, I also tack soldered at the top, so they're ready to be soldered together. I'm using a gel flux because I happen to like the gel flux because it's not quite as soft and drippy as like a liquid flux. So it stays in place where you put it, and the paste flux that you can get tends to be harder to put on because you have to paint it on exactly, whereas the gel flux won't really drip all over the place, but it will spread easier. Now, as you can see, I'm holding together the areas between the two circles with a pair of needle nose pliers and soldering them accordingly so that they will end up being pretty symmetrical. Now, life isn't perfect, so there's going to be some discrepancies, but basically I am holding, making this a pretty much a symmetrical garden ball. Now, the reason I chose that size circle was because that was the size circle that would fit in the space that I had left. So I decided that that's the size I'm going to use. After I soldered this all together and cleaned it, then I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to put inside that circle, what's going to fit with all the glass and stuff that I own. But right now I'm just making a nice armature to work off of. I know I'm going to have to add some color to this because I don't want it just all wire. So at this point, I'm just working on the wire shape itself and making sure it's very sturdy and all soldered together. That's why I wrapped the hoop at the top right there. That's why I wrapped it with foil like the other hoop, because I wanted to be able to solder to it. Now, you don't have to coat everything with solder at this point. You can wait till later on in the process. But if you coat everything with solder now, when you want to solder other objects to this, it just solders so much faster, because solder will stick to solder easier than anything else, because that's what it does. Okay, now I have this coily thing. I ended up using this end that's all twisted together as the top of my ball. At this point, I didn't know if it was going to hang with that at the bottom or the top, so it was kind of still up in the air. But so I added a lot of flux to the twisted area, and now I am coating that whole area with solder. So basically, once you add flux to it, as soon as you put solder on it, it just kind of sucks into all the areas that you want soldered, because copper just accepts solder so easily. So if you make stuff with copper or brass, you will find that the 60-40 solder will adjust to it and suck into it really, really easily. Now the other metals will accept solder, but you may find that some accept it, easier than others. But whatever you buy, try to get bare copper. Don't buy things that have been coated. Don't buy wires and stuff that are tarnish resistant, because that means they've coated them with something. You want the metal to be bare, so that the solder will want to stick to it and just kind of automatically suck right into it. You could use lead-free solder. Lead-free solder is just a little bit harder to get it to melt and flow, but that is an option if that's something you want. You notice that at the top of my video is that yellow thing. That is a fume exhauster. You'll want to use a fume exhauster to suck all the fumes away from you. I have my fume exhauster, instead of just the filter at the end of it, I also have it, I took the filter off and attached a regular dryer hose to it and have it go outside immediately. So it's sucking everything right outside. It's not trying to filter it and then make it come back in my studio. It's just sucking it out. Sometimes you notice I use silicone gloves all the time when I'm working. Right now, I really don't need to because I'm not actually physically holding something really close to my fingers as I'm soldering. It's all been wired together ahead of time, and I'm pretty much just coating everything to hold it together. So as you can see, my iron is kind of dying, because usually once I touch it on a piece of solder, it melts the solder immediately. But because this iron tip is kind of getting old, it's just not wanting to work very well, even when I clean it. I even turned the temperature up to around 500 to try to get it to cooperate, but it's just not doing what it usually does. So, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and buy a new tip. That gooey stuff on the on my work table right there is flux that has dropped off. So that's why I should clean my work surface some, because it's getting a little icky. So I'm trying to go around and make sure that everything is coated as thoroughly as I can. And after this step, I will probably wash it, because it's gotten pretty much coated and ready for me to start thinking about adding some glass, some color, some bling, whatever. So those circles that I made earlier, that I showed that I created going over a ceramic light fixture, they were a little bit too big for any of the glass that I happen to own. I don't have anything quite that big. So my biggest glass things that are sitting there on the right side there are around 1 inch diameter, a little over 1 inch. Those will have to be what I use, because I don't have anything any bigger. So instead of like cutting new ones on my saw, I decided I'm just going to use those. So I made some more loops, and I'm going to solder these glass globs into it. Now these glass globs are ones that I purchased, and I already wrapped foil around them. I used about 1/3 or 1/2 of your regular 7/32 inch foil, and I usually use black backed foil, so that when I'm done, we can see inside my globs or whatever I foiled, it won't have that copper. It'll have a dark look. So it's either going to be for when I use black patina or copper patina, it'll look fine. I have those silicone washers there if I need to hold the hoop up a little bit as I'm soldering, because I actually want this copper ring to be at the thickest part of my glass glob, which is a little bit off the back. So that's why I have those those silicone washers there to use. So right now I am soldering one of them on. I'm using my regular gel flux and my regular solder, and I'm just soldering all the way around it, and then I'm going to flip it over and do the back so that it's completely soldered on as much as possible. And yes, you will have to turn it over again. You will have to keep looking at both sides of it so that it looks good, because sometimes when you solder one side and then you turn it over, you have created some interesting globs on the other side. So that that end that was sticking up, I bent that over, and I'm using that with a little loop to loop on to my original hoop. Yeah, I took the silicone ball out, pulled that out and all the stuffing out of my project. So now I just have the armature that I made. So as you can see, this glass is kind of going to be centered within the original round circle that I made. And I am just trying to see how it's going to be centered. I use that purple thing is a silicone like wand stir stick thing that I bought that one would use when making like resin. Silicone's just really awesome because it's easy to clean and it's heat resistant. So solder's not going to stick to it. So I do use silicone pieces often to help me hold things in place. It's just really handy material. So I'm using that as kind of a guide. I'm going to stick more of my glass globs into the circles, and I'm going to solder them together so they're all like perfect, as perfect as I can get. See, it's really kind of hard to hold that, to make a wire circle the same exact shape as one of these glass globs, which are not perfectly symmetrical, is a little bit challenging. You may have to adjust your circle at times, your wire at times to fit. And I have at times like soldered half of it on and then cut the wire and rebent it. So whatever makes it work. What I wanted was a circle going around the glass glob to hold it sturdy, because if I had just soldered that glass glob with the foil around it into my garden unit, it wouldn't have been as strong. But having a wire circle around the outside of the glass will help secure it. Because remember, when I foiled the glass glob, I had only used a thin, like half or a third of the 7/32 inch foil. So it's not really wrapping around the glass very much, because I didn't really want to cover this beautiful glob of glass. I just wanted to, make it so that I can attach something to it. So it's only really attached by the solder and the stickiness of the foil. So you can't really expect it to be all that strong. So that's why I always, when possible, give it some extra strength. You see how I'm turning it over a few times to make sure there's no weird globs as much as possible. And then, of course, I bent the top there, that little thing that's sticking up, I bend that over so that I have something to loop over the hoop in my project to attach it. So that was the whole thought process there, because I knew it was going to still be a little bit small, so I wanted to use that little loop as the hanger. And then when I soldered it in place, if the new circle with the glass was touching the original circle, I added extra solder there, so it got a little bit extra secure in that place. So yeah, sometimes my fume exhauster is in the way, but you can see what I'm doing. I am soldering. I just soldered that in place. So I have a whole bunch more to do. No big deal. I have my little washers, and you can get these little silicone washers in different sizes, and they're really handy. You can reuse them forever because they don't melt. And if they get too icky and fluxy, just wash them. That's a fine thing to do. When I'm soldering something like this, the beginning of the soldering, you're almost like dropping globs of solder in place, because if you try to do one area without tacking the other side, the whole thing will like get out of shape. So I usually drop a few pieces of solder around the circle first and then fill it in with solder. Another thing about using a nice round hoop to start out with is it does kind of make these somewhat not symmetrical glass globs. It kind of makes them into more symmetrical circles, at least visually. So for this kind of project, I wanted this project to be pretty much symmetrical. Now there are times when I'm using glass globs and I am actually relishing in the fact that they're not perfectly round and they look better and they fit better, being a little abstract, not symmetrical. Now I'm adding some flat glass circles that I bought on Amazon that I have also foiled, but this time I had to foil them with like only a quarter of the strip because they are pretty thin pieces of glass. They're not quite as thick as regular sheet glass, so that they will take a thinner piece. But they fit very nicely in these spaces that I had left at this end of my garden ball, so that worked very nicely. I also added some balls on the other side near where the twisted end is. I used some smaller glass globs that were foiled. I don't think I have a video of me actually soldering them on, but it's basically the same thing. I didn't wrap these in wire first because they're a lot smaller and I don't think they'll be knocked off quite as easily as the big globs. So I didn't wrap these. Now when I was doing these, there was one that did come off and I had to put a new one on. So make very sure that that you don't add too much heat to something like this, because these are actually only foiled on the edges of their circles, so they really aren't even like encased at all with the foil. It's just going around the outside edge. The solder will go around a little bit farther than just the edge at times, and that'll help hold it on, but they're mainly just held on to the glass with the stickiness of the foil. So that's why you really need to burnish down the foil quite nice and smoothly so that it's held in place as much as possible, because that's all you got for support. So as you can see, I'm using these little clamps to clamp them in place at times. There are some inconsistencies with this, so that some of them are a little bit closer together. I think a couple of them even had to overlap a slight bit, because I mean my project's not completely symmetrical, although I tried to. So you know, life isn't perfect, but pretty close. One reason I'm using bought glass circles is because they're pretty darn perfect. Now, right now, I had bought some glass decorative beads, and I used copper wire and made some more circles. And right now, I am soldering the ends of the circles, because they got to be soldered so that nothing falls apart. It's kind of a pain, because you want to make sure, if you have, like, if you're doing loops like this, like making a chain, that when you solder them together, you are not making it so that it can no longer move. So especially like these little ones that I'm soldering right now, you want to put flux on the solder joint, put your nib right there with a little bit of solder on it, and pretty much just hold it there till it heats up and makes the joint. If you put too much solder on it, it'll end up closing the hoop. Now my project's pretty much done. I've washed it and it's very pretty. I'm going to spray it with copper patina. And you can see I'm using gloves, because patina is really, really yucky and hazardous. So you don't want to breathe it in or get it on your skin. So I am using a spray because there's so many different directions and surfaces that I didn't want to just use a paintbrush or a toothbrush for the whole thing, or a cotton swab that some people use. But I did touch it up with an old toothbrush if there were areas that were missed. And you can see those, the chain links at the bottom ended up taking the copper patina. You know, they didn't really take the copper patina, it was just the solder does. So it wasn't quite the same color copper, but they ended up all going very nicely together. And it's a very decorative, I think, kind of Victorian looking design when it was done. And I think it was very pretty and very elegant. And at night, it lit up very nicely and really looked like a very pretty decoration for the front yard. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.